Welcome back to the Study with Me, EU Law podcast. If you're prepping for exams on the EU's constitutional setup, well, you're in the right place. This is going to be crucial. Today, we're really digging into those three big principles that honestly govern pretty much everything the EU does legislatively: Conferral, subsidiarity, and proportionality. And we're not just going to read definitions. We want to show you how these three act as, gatekeepers, managing that whole balance between Brussels and the member states.
Exactly. Think of them as the core rules of the game. If you understand how they work, and importantly, the tensions between them, you've basically got the key to understanding the legitimacy of EU law. So let's kick off with the absolute foundation, the most fundamental one, the principle of conferral. Right, so conferral. It's laid out in Article 5 of the Treaty on European Union, the TEU, and it states very clearly that the Union can only act within the limits of the powers, the competences that the treaties have explicitly given it, and crucially, it has to be acting to achieve the objectives set out in those same treaties.
Okay, so conferral really underlines that the EU isn't, a standard country with inherent powers. The member states are in charge of the treaties. They hold the original power. That's why we often hear that term sui generis, unique, one of a kind. Its powers are given, not intrinsic.
Precisely. The EU doesn't have original competences. That's something the Court of Justice, the CJEU, made clear way back in landmark cases like Van Gent and Loos. It only possesses those specific powers that have been handed over by the member states.
Which leads us straight to this idea of the speciality of EU competences, right? Basically, if a power isn't written down, explicitly mentioned in the treaties, then it hasn't been transferred. It's quite strict. And Article 4 of the TEU kind of reinforces this, saying anything not given to the Union stays with the member states. That's the default.
Absolutely. And that strictness creates a huge procedural step for the EU institutions every time they want to legislate. They have to pinpoint the legal basis.
Yeah.
Because conferral is so foundational, they're constitutionally obliged to cite the exact treaty article that gives them the authority to act. They can't just wing it.
And this isn't just box ticking, is it? It sounds like choosing the legal basis is a really big deal politically. Why all the fuss?
Oh, it's huge. Because that choice dictates, well, two critical things. First, the whole legislative process, like who needs to be consulted, who gets a say, maybe even a veto. And second, the voting rules in the council. Some legal bases need everyone to agree unanimity, giving every state a veto. Others use qualified majority voting, which makes it much easier to pass laws.
Okay, so that's where the Court of Justice comes in with this center of gravity theory. If the institutions try to pick an easier legal basis, the court steps in.
Exactly. The CJEU looks at the law's actual purpose and main subject matter, its center of gravity, and forces the institutions to use the correct legal basis, even if it's politically harder for them. It's a key judicial check.
Can you give us a concrete example of conferral leading to something significant?
Sure. A great one is Article 81 of the TFEU, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. That single article confers power for judicial cooperation in civil matters. And based just on that, the EU built its entire framework of private international law, things like the Brussels I regulation on court jurisdiction, or the Rome regulations on which countries' law applies. Huge areas of law, all stemming from that one specific competence.
Okay, so conferral tells us what powers the EU actually possesses. Now, assuming the EU does have the power based on conferral, how are those powers organized? Where does the friction usually happen?
Well, the Lisbon Treaty brought in a clearer classification, which was helpful. We now talk about three main types: exclusive competence under Article 3 PFEU, then there's shared competence in Article 4 TFEU, and finally supporting competence, which you find in Articles 5 and 6 TFEU.
Exclusive means only the EU can act, right?
Yeah.
And supporting is where the EU just helps out, coordinates, but can't really harmonize laws.
That's it. Supporting competence is very light touch. Think coordination, funding, sharing best practices, no heavy harmonization.
But it feels like most of the action, and probably most of the exam questions, are around shared competence. Now, the name shared sounds collaborative, but you hinted it's a bit misleading.
It is deeply misleading in practice. Shared competence is where this really important concept, the principle of preemption, operates. What it means is, yes, initially, both the EU and the member states can legislate in these areas, but, and this is the crucial bit, once the Union does legislate and regulate a specific part of that shared area, the member states lose their power to act in that exact space. Their competence is preempted.
So shared really means potentially exclusive for the EU down the line. Every time the EU acts in a shared area, national power shrinks a bit. Okay, that makes the next principle, subsidiarity, seem absolutely vital then. It must be there to control this preemption somehow.
Precisely. Subsidiarity acts as the main constitutional brake on that gradual takeover via preemption. But before we dive into subsidiarity, let's just quickly look at a clear example of where preemption doesn't apply supporting competence. The Erasmus program is perfect.
Right, Erasmus. Everyone knows it. Higher education itself is definitely a national thing. Member states decide their own university system.
Exactly. But the EU steps in with Erasmus, not to dictate curricula, but purely to support students moving across borders to help with recognizing studies abroad. Critically, the EU cannot use Erasmus to harmonize higher education laws. So France can completely change its university entry requirements tomorrow, and Erasmus doesn't stop that. No preemption happens.
Got it. That clarifies the difference nicely. So now on to subsidiarity itself, the principle that does apply in those tricky shared competence areas. You called it the need test. Okay, so Article 5, Paragraph 3 of the TEU, that defines subsidiarity. It says the union should only step in if and insofar as the objectives of the proposed action can't be sufficiently achieved by the member states acting alone, either at national, regional, or local level. But, and this is the key part, the objectives can be better achieved by action at the union level. That better achieved bit is what we often call the EU added value test.
That's the core question. It's a judgment call, a normative standard. And it primarily binds the EU institutions drawing up the laws, especially the Commission, which initiates most legislation. And you have to remember who benefits here. It's the member states. Subsidiarity is designed to protect their remaining powers in shared areas, to stop the EU interfering where it's not genuinely necessary or adding value.
Okay, so first, Conferral says if the EU has the power. Then subsidiarity asks, should the EU use that power in this specific case? Does it add value? Now, assuming the answer is yes, there's still one more hurdle, proportionality. This sounds like it's about not using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The least invasive test.
That's a perfect way to put it. Proportionality is all about how the union exercises its power. It's in Article 5, Paragraph 4 of the TEU. It demands that the content and form of union action must not go beyond what is necessary to achieve the objectives of the treaties. Basically, use the minimum intervention required.
And the courts, the CJEU, must take this seriously when they review EU laws. Is there a specific test they apply?
Yes. There's a well-established two-part test for proportionality challenges. First, the court asks, is the measure suitable? Meaning, is it actually capable of achieving the legitimate goal the EU says it's aiming for? But the second part is often more critical. Is the measure necessary? Or, put another way, is this the least restrictive option available that could still achieve the same goal? If there's a lighter touch way, the EU should have used that instead.
Okay, and does this preference for the least restrictive option have real-world consequences for the types of laws the EU tends to use, especially in those shared competence areas?
Absolutely. The most significant practical consequence is a general preference for using directives over regulations, particularly in shared competence fields. You find the definitions in Article 288 TFEU.
Why is that? What makes a directive less invasive, more proportional than a regulation?
Well, think about how they work. A regulation is like, as you said, a constitutional sledgehammer. It's directly applicable everywhere, aiming for complete uniformity. It often just pushes national law aside entirely. Very invasive. A directive, on the other hand, is more nuanced. It sets minimum standards or objectives that all member states must achieve. But crucially, it leaves it up to each member state how they achieve those results, using their own laws and procedures. It respects national systems much more. That makes it inherently more proportional in many situations.
Right, so we have these legal principles, conferral, subsidiarity, proportionality, and the Court of Justice overseeing them, ready to strike down laws under Article 263 TFEU if they breach the rules. But didn't the Lisbon Treaty add something else? A more political way to check these principles, especially subsidiarity. Yes, this is the part that often comes up in exams because it links the legal rules directly to national politics. We need to talk about Protocol Number 2, which Lisbon attached to the treaties. This protocol sets up a system for ex-ante political control, meaning control before a law is passed by national parliaments. And it specifically focuses on checking compliance with subsidiarity for legislative acts.
That's right. And this political check actually starts with the Commission itself. Under Article 296 TFEU, the Commission already had to justify its proposals. But now, that includes an explicit duty to explain why the proposed action meets the subsidiarity test, why it genuinely has EU added value. Then comes the really interesting part involving national parliaments. Every draft legislative act has to be sent directly to them in every member state. They then get a window 8 weeks to examine the proposal and issue what's called a reasoned opinion. if they think it breaches the principle of subsidiarity. And importantly, each national parliament gets 2 votes in this process. It doesn't matter if it's Germany or Malta.
2 votes per parliament. Okay, and this leads to these mechanisms people talk about, the yellow card and the orange card. How do they work? Let's start with yellow. Okay, the yellow card. This gets triggered if at least 1/3 of the total votes available across all national parliaments are cast against the proposal, arguing it fails the subsidiarity test. Though the threshold is lower, just 1/4, if the proposal is in the area of freedom, security, and justice, because that's seen as particularly sensitive. What happens then? Does the proposal die?
Not automatically. But the consequence is still significant. The Commission is legally obliged to reconsider the proposal. They have to review it, taking into account the concerns raised. They can still decide to proceed, but they have to issue a reasoned decision explaining why they disagree with the national parliaments.
So it forces a pause and justification. What about the orange card? That sounds more serious.
It is. The orange card requires a higher threshold. A simple majority of the total available votes from national parliaments must be cast against the proposal on subsidiarity grounds. Again, the Commission must reconsider. But here's the added bite. If the Commission, after reconsidering, decides it still wants to push ahead with the proposal, the issue then escalates. The proposal, along with the Commission's justification and the national parliament's objections, goes to the EU's legislative bodies, the Council and the European Parliament, and now they have the power to block it. If either the Council, acting by a 55% majority of its members, or the European Parliament, by a simple majority of votes cast, agrees with the national parliaments that the proposal breaches subsidiarity, the proposal is dead. It cannot proceed further.
Wow, okay. So the orange card gives national parliaments, collectively, a potential legislative veto mediated through the council or parliament. That really highlights the political weight of subsidiarity, doesn't it? It lets national democratic bodies push back before a law gets made. This has been incredibly helpful. Let's try to synthesize this for someone studying. A quick recap. Conferral is about the scope of power. It asks, what can the EU legally do? Is the power actually written down in the treaties?
Exactly. Then subsidiarity tackles the necessity or the justification. It asks, should the EU act in this specific instance, even if it has the power? Is there genuine EU added value, or could the member states handle it effectively themselves? It's the political and judicial break.
And finally, proportionality governs how the EU should act, assuming it has the power and there's a need. It's the least invasive test, pushing for methods, like using directives, that achieve the goal while respecting national systems as much as possible.
Perfect summary. And these 3 principles, they're not static. They are constantly interacting, creating this dynamic tension. It's that very tension that tries to balance having an effective union capable of achieving its goals with fundamentally protecting the sovereignty of the member states.
Right, there's a constant balancing act. Okay, so to leave you, our listeners, with something to really chew on as you continue your studies, we've talked a lot about conferral providing rigidity. The EU only has the powers it's given, but the system isn't completely inflexible, is it? Think about the idea of implicit powers that the court developed linked to this concept of effect utile or practical effectiveness.
Yes, the AETR case is the classic example there.
Yeah.
The court essentially said that if the EU has the power to make rules internally on a subject, it must implicitly also have the power to make international agreements on that same subject externally. That's now reflected in Article 216 TFEU.
Or what about the flexibility clause itself, Article 352 TFEU? That allows the Council, acting unanimously, to adopt measures needed to attain treaty objectives, even if the treaties didn't explicitly provide the necessary powers.
So, the final thought for you is this. How does the ongoing interplay, the balancing act, performed by the courts and the political institutions between the strictness of conferral and these mechanisms for flexibility like implicit powers in Article 352 actually shape the future direction and the ultimate reach of EU power?
It's a fascinating question, and it guarantees that this area of EU law will keep evolving.